North American Nintendo fans probably are aware of the magazine called Nintendo Power, but over here in Europe we didn't have such a thing. Somewhere around the mid-90s I became a member of Club Nintendo, and received a subscription to their free newsletter, the Nintendo News. It was called Nintendo 64 News until 1999, but I just called it Nintendo News. This newsletter was sent to me 2 to 4 times a year depending on how things were going on the Nintendo front, and whenever it did appear, it was a big deal for me. Sadly, I've managed to misplace my very first issues, which were drumming up the release of the N64, and especially Super Mario 64. What made it sad is that it had some of those early screenshots of the game content that you didn't see in the finished version. The earliest issue I seem to own is the 4th issue of 1997, and it was pretty much celebrating all the cool new releases of the N64, and I can pride myself in the fact that I've either bought or at least played all but one of the games shown on the cover. Also, I have this one which is a bunch of advertisements for Game Boy and SNES games, but you can clearly see that this was late 1997 as they featured the SNES games at the back of the newsletter after the Game Boy games. Also, I seem to have misplaced the first 2 issues of 1998, but we'll get back to that later. The first 2 issues of 1999 were the last N64 heavy issues to come out, both making a big deal out of the N64 releases of Star Wars Episode 1 Racer and Donkey Kong 64. But considering these were the games put on the magazine's fronts, they both got surprisingly little space for their overviews, just about as much as the other featured reviews for each magazine. Oh look, Castlevania. The coolest thing about this issue with Episode 1 Racer is that it alludes to the future release of Nintendo's upcoming console, the Dolphin, which we now of course know as the GameCube. And look, an early screenshot of Eternal Darkness, Paper Mario, Resident Evil 2 for the N64, and Rika? Now you see who that is peeking into the cover with DK on it. There was a clear pattern with Nintendo news from the second issue of 99 up to the first issue of 2001. Pokemon. Yeah, alright, issue 3 from 2000 seems to be promoting Majora's Mask, but it still had Pokemon on the cover, and the centerfold is actually a list of all the new Pokemon featured in the Gold and Silver editions. Wait, Pokemon centerfold? That just sounded really disturbing. Well, it's obvious these issues were covering up the fact that the N64 wasn't doing so well anymore. I mean, there were barely any N64 games featured in these issues. The first of 2000 has a little bit of text devoted to the N64 release of Resident Evil 2, and it's basically just telling that the limited release had been sold out and that gamers should grab a copy at the first sight of one. Yeah, that's helpful. Sheesh. Honestly, they might as well just change the name to Pokemon News. Now, the next 3 issues of 2001 were heavily featuring Nintendo's new handheld, the Game Boy Advance, but they also all made the effort of devoting a page, or 2, or 3 to Nintendo's upcoming GameCube. I remember reading about Excitebike 64 on the second issue of 2001, and thinking to myself that the N64 days were now officially over. I mean, it was creepy. I had just recently played Excitebike on an NES emulator, and now the 64 version came out like a sad swan song for the system. Well, finally, the first issue of 2002 was all about the glorious new console that is GameCube. It's just a shame I had to mutilate the cover because I had to cut out the form to confirm my subscription to Nintendo News. Damn you, Club Nintendo. There were only 3 issues of the magazine released in 2002, and the first and only issue of 2003 started with an announcement that Nintendo News was moving its stuff to the shithole that is the Nintendo website of Finland. I can't be kind about this, since they barely have any news or even up-to-date info on new games that are coming out. And the sad thing about these last few issues is that they really don't feature anything noteworthy, just the same games you've probably already played on the GameCube. Such was not the way of things during the early days. I didn't even remember there being this many great games for the N64. And while they also had info on all the latest upcoming games for the N64, they also devoted time and space for the games that had already come out. You know, just so you didn't miss out on anything. Now, my favorite issue of Nintendo News was issue 4 of 1998. Why? Well, just look at it. It's printed on hard paper, not that light shit that wrinkles and wears out over time. This thing was made to last. And this was also the last publication where I read about Ocarina of Time, before I eventually got it as a Christmas present. Oh, here's the article that suckered me into buying Holy Magic Century. That other ISS game for the N64? 180 Snowboarding, which Nintendo apparently saw fit to release on the Virtual Console. And 12 Tales of Conquer, way before the game would eventually become the infamous Conker's Bad Fur Day. Ah, the fun memories. Most people are aware of Konami's Pro Evolution series of football/soccer games, but not a lot of people seem to remember the International Superstar Soccer series. The games got their start on the Super Nintendo, and later 2 more games were made for the N64, before the series was more or less forgotten. There apparently was an ISS for the GameCube, but I've certainly never heard of it. I'm not really a big football fan myself, but ISS 64 has a bit of a classic charm about it that occasionally makes me want to play it. Now, if you're wondering how ISS 64 compares to other football games of the day, I'd say it's a bit more realistic than the old FIFA games, but only a little. The game lacks the official player names, as in so many other Konami football games, but the participating countries of the day are represented accurately. Probably the best mode of the game is the World Cup, which will eventually lead to a great credit sequence. Now, before we tackle anything else, let me name the reasons I like this game. For one, you get to create your own team. Sure, you're forced to pick their faces from a ready selection, and physically every player is identical except for their skin tone and head. But at least you can give them funny names. Another thing I love are the announcers. Now, the announcing technology in this game is obviously out of date, but that's what I love about it. When the playing becomes too intense, the computer can't seem to keep up, and you start to hear a very weird variety of noises. Also, the fact that the commentaries are just pasted from various samples is almost comically obvious. And even better, every time you score, the announcers go insane. And no matter how lame your goal was, you will always have a chance to view it on replay over and over and over again. The best parts about scoring are the goofy victory dances and moves your players do after a goal. And if you just want to check these out, put the difficulty on the easiest possible and wipe the floor with Japan, or some other nation you have a beef with. At first glance, the game can either seem very simple or complicated, depending on what kind of approach you're used to in a soccer game. You can alter your team's formations, change players once they start to tire, and even mark opposing team's players. However, at the easiest difficulty level, you can pretty much run from the middle of the field and score within the first half minute without anyone standing in your way. But even on harder levels, being aggressive and tenaciously cutting off the computer team is the surest way to victory. Once you get good enough, the only way the game can really beat you is if you go up against Italy or Brazil at the highest difficulty level. But even when you can lose, winning the World Cup and seeing your team in the credit roll is very satisfying. My biggest gripes with the game are with the graphics, and as I already mentioned, all the players are the exact same height, width, and build, with only their shirts, faces, and skin tone telling them apart. But essentially, you could have a team consisted entirely of albino clones. The music is also a bit of an underachievement from Konami, who are known for their many great game soundtracks. Okay, I admit the menu and scoreboard themes are okay, as well as the victory celebration music and the credits theme. But what's up with the opening? Does this even classify as music? Sheesh. And even if it did, I honestly couldn't tell you what genre it's from. But overall, ISS 64 has the classic charm of an old sports game, and it's still a lot of fun to play despite its shortcomings, or perhaps specifically because of those. This may sound like a bit of a mixed compliment because for the time the ISS series claimed to fame was its noticeably more realistic take on football. But because it's such a great game, if an outdated one, it makes the game still stand out, especially on the N64, which didn't have that many good sports games. Here are some easy, surefire strategies to get you started in ISS 64. First, take a look at the opposing team's formation and change your own formation accordingly. If the opposing team has a particularly strong defense formation, you might need to mark some players. Also, try to place your own players in the gaps in the opposing team's formation so you can get a clear run to the goal. You should always nonetheless have 3 to 4 players on defense to make sure the opposing team's forward players won't be able to make a run for your goal, or that you'll at least have a decent chance of tackling them before they get a shot. If you only have 2 men, the computer will get a lot of easy shot, unless your defenders are the fastest players on the team. The best way to keep the game under control is to be aggressive about getting the ball. Don't use the B button to tackle though, since that's the surest way to get a foul in this game. You can skip the coin toss at the beginning by pressing start, and when you do this, the game randomly picks which side you're playing at and which team gets the ball in the start. When you start the game with the ball, it's not a good idea to just run straight ahead. Instead, pass the ball to either one of the sides and back to get the ball away from the opposing team's players and to allow your midfielders and forwards to get further up the field. Always try to have someone on your team starts from the middle of the field. Whenever the computer team starts with the ball, they usually try to slip through the middle of the field, but you can get the ball easily enough if you get a midfielder to the opposing player in time before he makes the pass. You can also headbutt a long pass away from the opposing team's players by pressing B. Pressing A isn't a good idea unless there's one of your own players ready to take the headbutt pass. Remember that you can sprint by pressing C down, and this is a good thing to do once you're closing in on the goal. Just remember to slow down so that the goalie doesn't get the ball, and remember that you can't maneuver as easily while sprinting. Also, sprinting wears your players out, so try to preserve the sprints for when you really need them. And finally, corner kicks and throw-ins can be difficult. If the opposing team is doing the corner kick or throw-in, try to intercept the ball and get it as far away from the goal as possible. Sometimes kicking it blindly up the field will buy you some time to recover. Nintendo had a couple of name trends during the 90s that most people probably remember. When the Super Nintendo came around, Nintendo wanted to brand many of the titles on it by adding the word Super to the title. Remember Super Castlevania 4, Super Metroid, Super Star Wars, Super Adventure Island? Wow! I guess everything was a little super back in the day. But obviously there was one franchise where this naming technique didn't really work. That's right, Super Mario. So, what did Nintendo do? Well, Nintendo's answer seems to have always been attaching a random word at the end of the name, but back in the day they got into the habit of attaching a geographical term at the end of the game's name. They'd already done this once with Super Mario Land on the Game Boy, so they basically went a couple of levels up, skipping continent, and went straight to Super Mario World. After that sunshine bullshit, they returned with Galaxy, though I'd wish they'd gone with Super Mario Solar System first. I wonder what's next, Super Mario Universe? But believe me, this trend caught on. In case you didn't know, the Mega Man Game Boy games are actually called Rockman World in Japan. Even Rare got in on the action when they released Donkey Kong Country for the Super Nintendo. So if you ever wondered where they came up with such an odd name for a game, well, now you know. But wait a minute, why wasn't this game called Super Donkey Kong Country? I mean, it didn't have Super in the title, did it? Well, you'd be surprised to find out that the DKC series is actually called Super Donkey Kong in Japan. But since Rare is a British company, in an odd twist of fate, it is for once the Japanese name that is the corrupted form of the Western title, and not vice versa. The odd thing about the whole Super thing is that people use it very inconsistently. I mean, every Castlevania fan I know always calls this game just Castlevania 4, dropping the Super, but honestly, I don't get why they had to have the Roman numeral in the first place, since the game's essentially a remake of the first game in the series. I guess it's the kind of ass-backwards logic that made Dracula's Curse Castlevania 3, while the game is actually a prequel to the first two games. Kinda like Metal Gear Solid 3. Well, anyway, it wasn't until the N64 that Nintendo seriously began putting the system brand on everything. Super Mario 64, Pilotwings 64, Wave Race 64, Star Fox 64, Bomberman 64, Mario Kart 64, Donkey Kong 64, and even Kirby 64. Whoa. Man, I remember how I used to get a lot of jabs at school about the fact that the Commodore 64 had the exact same brand number. And it's kind of odd since Nintendo does have a history of inventive subtitles. I mean, just look at the Zelda series. Each game, minus the first one, has a distinct subtitle to tell them apart. Adventure of Link, A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and so on. You know what's kind of sad? They were actually going to call this game Super Mario Kart R before they changed it to Mario Kart 64. Luckily, Nintendo didn't go through with the 64 bullshit for every single game. I remember there being talk about Ocarina of Time when it was literally being referred to as Zelda 64. And it wasn't just any game magazine, it was Nintendo's own official publication. I know in hindsight there was probably no way they were gonna leave that as the official title, but it still creeps me out just thinking about it. They were even going to call this game F-Zero 64, but at the last minute they changed it to F-Zero X. And though they called this game Star Fox 64 in North America, it was released as Lilac Wars in Europe, and I honestly think it's a better title, though I would have liked it even more if they'd at least left Star Fox in the title. So nowadays, Nintendo's branding craze has really toned down. But there are still games that occasionally get this branded treatment, such as Mario Kart Wii, Mario Kart DS, and Super Mario Advance. Oh boy. But at least it's not as bad as it used to be.